Hello and welcome to the Beautiful Business Podcast, where today I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor Nancy Doyle. For those of you who don't know, Nancy is an occupational psychologist and the founder of Genius Within, a company that supports neurodivergent adults and the organisations that employ them. Whether it's through groundbreaking research, public speaking, or her insightful writing, Nancy's influence is literally changing lives and slowly transforming how we understand this intimidating subject. Today, I can't wait to delve into neurodivergence with Nancy to help us all understand it a little bit better, as well as how we can support ourselves and our colleagues in the workplace and create a truly inclusive environment.
Culture and communication is important, but we think it's our job to make that happen rather than just buy in people that fit. Do you know? Because if you do the buying in people that fit, what you end up with is people that are like you. Because my communication style as an ADHD woman is very, 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 very different to the communication style of an autistic man. I mean, that's the other thing. You know, we've got 68% neurodivergent people. So we've got people at the edges, at the margins in the way that they communicate and the way that they like to work. But we're opposites. Neurodivergent people aren't an amorphous mass. So the level of chaos and irregularity that I need in order to be creative at work is completely disabling for an autistic person who likes routine and consistency.
Welcome to the Beautiful Business Podcast from the WOW Company. If you're searching for the right strategies, tools, and connections to ignite your thinking and elevate your business, then join us for a fortnightly dose of inspiration. Our guests range from industry-leading agencies and cutting-edge tech pioneers to motivational speakers and executives, all offering actionable insights to help you thrive in profit and purpose. So, whether you're a growing consultancy or an agency leader, this podcast is your source of knowledge and encouragement to spark meaningful change in your business and beyond. Nancy, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining. How are you doing?
My pleasure, and I'm fine, thank you.
Good. Tell us something about you as a person that we don't already know. Like, we've got this amazing kind of career history that we know a little bit about, but what about you as a person? What don't we know about you?
Oh, I could be really mischievous here. I've got my mischievous head on. So, what you might not know is that I am a mother to 18-year-old twins who are just about to leave home. So I've had a kind of quite intense experience of parenthood, going from 0 to 2, and I'm about to go from 2 to 0. Although I have it on good, solid advice that they will continue to bounce back for many years. My life is about to change quite considerably in terms of what I'm doing at home. It will just be me and the old husband.
Oh, wow. That's going to be a real shift for you then. Are they off to university?
Yes, they are. I've got one going to UCL to do the Bachelor of Art and Science combined degree. And I've got another one going to Southampton to do mechanical engineering.
Wow, amazing. Yes. So have you got any plans for what you're going to do for that shift in energy in the house? Are you going to go on some nice holidays?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah. So the first thing is we're going to book a holiday that isn't in term time. There's in term time, because we've had to do out of term time holidays for 14 years. So we're going to just first of all completely just go to the Caribbean in January because we can. So that's the first thing. Actually, probably the first thing is this other thing. So when I was pregnant, we got a present from my husband's godmother who lives in Paris, and it was the most beautiful bone china set of coffee cups, like really delicate but gorgeous. And they were a belated wedding present. So I was already pregnant when we got them, and I was sort of sat there looking at my bump with these 2 boys in it and this bone china coffee cup. I was like, well, that's not going to work, is it? So I said, what we should really do with these is put them away in the attic until the boys leave home. So recently we've got them out, and what we're going to do is sit on our deck outside our house and drink coffee out of our bone china coffee cups, and just kind of have a little moment of celebration of kind of successfully managing to not kill our children, to raise humans that we quite like, that appear not to be nasty, vile people, and appear to be quite kind, quite funny, and just go, well, there we go, and breathe.
Oh, wow. You were really in it for the long game when you made that plan, weren't you? That's amazing that it's finally coming to fruition. How exciting.
I know.
Oh, well done you. Well, that was lovely to hear. Thank you so much for sharing. And what I also would love to know a little bit more about is Genius Within. Tell us all about it, what you do and how it started and everything.
So Genius Within started in 2011. It was initially it was really an extension of my own consultancy. So I used to do work for Access to Work, do workplace needs assessments, diagnosis, coaching. I used to teach coaching. I worked with people who were long-term unemployed, and I worked as a consultant. I worked in a partnership and worked with several other kind of collaborators. And when my children started school, what I realised is it was very hard to go away for 3 or 4 days to do projects, because grandmas who do not live in the same town as you cannot look after children for 3 or 4 days when those children have to go to school. So my ability to work and how I could work started to change. And my husband was the same. He used to sort of have work where he would go away for 3 or 4 days. So we sat down and we looked at the numbers and we looked at how much coaching work I had coming in and whether or not I could delegate the far away work and the projects that were far away, get someone else to do those. So we realised that financially we could make that work and we could still pay the mortgage. So that was the first sort of income of Genius Within, was me subcontracting the far away work to other coaches that I knew. And in year 1, I had 7 subcontractors. By year 2, it was 25. By year 3, it was 52. By year 4, it was 74. Genius Within now has 230 subcontractors and 62 employees. So it turned into a very different business very quickly. It was only a couple of years before I had to stop doing any of the coaching and assessing myself and had to just run the business. So it was kind of, I'm kind of a reluctant entrepreneur in many ways, but once it had a bit of momentum, it became incredible fun. In 2014, we started working in the prison service, and we changed our legal status to a community interest company from a limited company. And what that means is that legally we have to reinvest 65% of our profits into services for our community each year. So we do that. We fund pro bono work for people that can't afford our services. We sponsor things. We give seed funding to grassroots organisations. For example, we've supported Black and Mamas, which is a network of 3,000 now. Women from the Black community who are raising special needs kids. We've seed funded a group called ADHD Babes, which is a fabulous organisation for Black and Brown minority ethnic women and non-binary people who are ADHD. We kind of keep our kind of momentum by making sure that what we're doing is generative for everybody. We also have an employee shared ownership scheme. I'm trying to do 2 things with Genius Within, really. I'm trying to do the neurodiversity thing well, and kind of professionalise it, because I'm an occupational psychologist. I studied work. I didn't just study neurodiversity. I studied work and neurodiversity. So kind of thinking about neurodiversity inclusive HR practice and coaching and performance management and relationships at work. That's stuff I know I've looked at and researched for a long time. So that was really important to me, was to professionalize neurodiversity services. But the other thing that's really important to me is to role model that businesses don't have to choose between being financially sustainable and mean. Like you can be a positive part of your community, a good employer, and still be financially successful. The 2 things don't have to be opposite.
Yeah, I really, really love that. And it's so refreshing to hear. And I think, just hearing all of those amazing things that you're doing, like, congratulations on how much it's grown and where it's gone to, because it sounds like, I know success is different for everyone, but it certainly sounds like a huge success. So congratulations for sure.
Well, we're up to nearly 10,000 people a year being supported through Genius Within. as individuals in the workplace as well, you know, we follow people up after a year and we find that 95% of them have kept their jobs, and 5% have moved on, which I think is a good stat. I wouldn't want it to be 100% of people have kept their jobs, because a lot of the people we work with are just in the wrong job and they actually need our help to move. And if they can do that elegantly without burning bridges, I think that's a positive outcome. But the one I'm really proud of is when we do our annual follow-ups, 25 to 30% of our graduates from our coaching or, you know, interventions have been promoted. 25 to 30% get promotion within a year. Well, they found their genius within, don't they?
Great name. Well done. Okay, so obviously, as I mentioned, would love to chat to you about neurodiversity today. And I guess considering your experience and the amount of work that you've done over the years, this might feel like bringing it right back to the basics, but I feel like it's a conversation that is still very new for a lot of people in some ways. And so just going right back to the very start, can you just share with us, it's probably a very big question actually, but also in the most simplest form, what is neurodiversity and what falls under the umbrella term neurodiverse?
Right. Okay, so neurodiversity, we can do a very literal interpretation of this. It means that human beings are diverse in our neurological functioning. So everybody falls under that umbrella. Because it's a property of our species rather than a property of an individual. So in the same way that the world is biodiverse, human brains are neurodiverse. They're different. They don't look like each other. My brain looks different to your brain, looks different to my husband's brain, looks different to my neighbour's brain. You know, our brains are different. That's basically what neurodiversity means. Neurodivergence is when you have an unusual neurotype. So within that diversity, there's kind of, you know, a solid neurotype that is reasonably, I'm loath to say the word normal, but kind of typical, neurotypical or neuronormative. There's a kind of range. We all have strengths and weaknesses. Every single person has strengths and weaknesses. But for about 2/3 of the population, those strengths and weaknesses all fall within the average range, or, you know, are much of a muchness. So I might be a little bit better at speaking than I am at reading, but it's not a massive difference. But for a neurodivergent brain, it's a massive difference. So the things that you're good at, you're very good at, and the things that you struggle with, you really struggle with. And those differences, I mean, you might find that someone's strengths are within the average range and their struggles are really quite significant challenges, or you might find that their strengths are massively above average and their challenges fall within the average range. The key thing is that there is a large difference between their strengths and their weaknesses. We call it the Spiky profile. It has statistical significance between those 2 points. And that profile of the Spiky profile is what connects all neurodivergent conditions, which include things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, tic disorders. And increasingly, we're actually starting to widen that umbrella and include bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, personality disorders, anxiety, depression. I'd very much like to start including general learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities, they call that in the States, because you've still got a spiky profile, even if your kind of cognitive abilities are in a below average range. There are other ways to measure human worth. You know, the way that we're measuring human worth is quite limited already. If we start measuring human worth to include things like loyalty and the ability to be consistent and emotionally connected, we start getting very different spiky profiles. So I think anyone who has an unusual neurotype is allowed to be a neurodivergent person. There's no police on the edge of this saying, well, this condition is in and this condition is out. And I think actually it's beholden on us to be inclusive as a community. That's kind of our thing, being inclusive. So, you know, let's just let people in if they want to come in and identify as neurodivergent. But the main thing I say to people when I ask this question is, if you're finding it confusing and ambiguous, that's because it's confusing and ambiguous. It's not because you've missed a key training or the book that explains it all, or, you know, a key article. It is confusing and ambiguous because it's something that's in transition. You know, we didn't used to think about it like this. We didn't used to think about it as unusual neurotypes and just, you know, people who were at the edge of the normal range. We used to think about it as there is a correct way to think and there is a broken way of thinking. It used to be that which we call the medical model. So a disease model of neurodiversity. This is what a normal brain does. This is what a broken brain does. So it was, and we're moving into this idea that it's part of diversity. And just as there's diversity, we've done this in gender. So, you know, gender used to be very binary, but we've moved beyond the binary. Sexuality used to be very binary. You were either homosexual or heterosexual, and now we've got lots and lots of in-betweens. And it's the same with neurodiversity. What we're realizing is that the range of human experience in the world is actually incredibly diverse, and that variety is very rich. It's part of the tapestry that makes us a very cooperative and complementary species that can evolve to do very unusual things because we have this unusualness within us, which makes the neurodivergent brain something rich in our genetic profile. It makes it something that creates possibilities and unusual thinking. And that's what the neurodiversity paradigm is trying to say, is that yes, an unusual neurotype has in the past brought suffering and difficulty and is still doing that, but there is also potential and opportunity in an unusual neurotype. And we need to think better about the questions we're asking to understand this, rather than just, you know, does it work in the standard school system? No, therefore it needs a label and it's broken. And that's what we did for 100 years. So we're trying to move on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. Thank you. Because it is so much to digest, isn't it? And I think that could even be the cause of why so many people have almost stood away from talking about it, because it feels really intimidating. It feels like such a scary subject, you know, even down to, am I going to offend somebody if I talk about it? You know, so I think people just choose sometimes to step back from having the conversation. And that's what, you know, we need to have that conversation, don't we? So that we can move forward and learn from it. Otherwise, we'll just stay stuck. There's a lot of kind of self-diagnosis, isn't there? I was always under the impression that you to be, I guess, labelled as ADHD or autistic or, you know, whatever falls under the neurodivergent kind of conditions, that you have to have a medical diagnosis, but that's just not the case, is it?
Well, it depends what you want the diagnosis for. You know, if you've got a child who needs an educational healthcare plan, you still need the medical diagnosis. Unfortunately, that's the way the system works. But you don't need a medical diagnosis to be supported at work. So something that a lot of people don't understand is that the Equality Act, the definition of disability, is not based on a medical diagnosis for anything. So if you're a diabetic, you might be disabled. You might not be disabled. It depends how bad your diabetes is. You know, if you've got peripheral neuropathy and you can't feel your feet, then that's quite disabling. But if you're well managed with insulin, then it's not very disabling at all. The definition of disability is the extent to which a physiological difference affects your ability to remember, to learn, to move, to communicate. And so, you know, you don't actually need that medical diagnosis to qualify for support under the Equality Act. And I wish more employers knew that, because they invest a lot of money in diagnosing their staff. And diagnosis is very cathartic for an individual if it's done well. If it's done well, and it's not just one that lists all your struggles and then sends you off on your way. You have to identify the peaks on that Spiky profile as well as the struggles, which is obviously what we do at Genius Within. And then you can have a bit more of a cathartic.
Come to that, don't worry.
Yeah. But you know, so as an individual, it's useful, but from a workplace perspective, it's not necessary. And in many ways, it's a bit of a kind of intrusion on that person's vulnerability and confidentiality. Well, it certainly shouldn't be used to prevent you from delivering support for that person. If you've got someone who has a consistent difficulty with memory, communication, learning or moving, or sensory perception, you should just support that person, whether, you know, they have a diagnosis or not. So that's the first thing to know. Secondly, waiting lists for diagnosis have gone up through the roof because awareness of neurodivergence has gone through the roof. But in terms of the population prevalence, when academics have done research to try and identify population prevalence, you take sort of 2,000 people, you test everybody, you see what the hundreds of those studies have been done. So we've got some quite reliable data that suggests to us that the population prevalence of neurodivergence is somewhere between 15 to 20% of the population. Now, I can tell you that 15 to 20% of the population do not have a diagnosis. So rising diagnosis is still nowhere near what we expect it to be. And the kind of people who don't get a diagnosis are the kind of people who either, don't have... diagnosis is privilege is probably the simplest way to summarize that. You've either got to be able to navigate your way through the healthcare system or the educational system and get the support you need, which usually relies on having parents, if you're for a child, who can navigate that system with you, and not everybody has parents who can navigate that system with them. It'll rely on your ability to pay privately. If you don't have an NHS or a education system that will do that for you in your area. And it's also bound by gender, by race, by class. There are so many ways in which some people are still feeling very stigmatized. There's still a lot of stigma in Black and brown communities about neurodivergence, much less likely to put forward for a diagnosis. I think the diagnosis process itself is kind of flawed and biased. So that makes self-diagnosis more essential. And when I do research, I always invite people who are self-diagnosed to participate. I always just ask, are you self-diagnosed, or are you diagnosed by a psychologist or a medic or a teacher? And what I haven't found yet is any difference between the people that are self-diagnosed and the people that are formally diagnosed. So my general rule is trust people. They usually haven't made this up. So my first instinct is to trust people. But what I would also add is a small caveat on that, because as misinformation has proliferated on social media, I think there are a lot of self-diagnoses that are possible. So, you might find people who they've identified as autistic, but they haven't really understood that they're dyspraxic as well, for example. Or they, so ADHD and bipolar disorder look very similar. Now, both of them are neurodivergent conditions. Both of them mean that we need reasonable adjustments in the workplace. But in terms of medical support, you would need to do two very different and opposite things. So it is sometimes helpful to get that medical diagnosis if you can, and to really understand yourself. But I think when people are self-diagnosing based on the community interactions they've had and the things they've found online, they haven't made things up. They might have the label slightly skewiffy, but they're not it's not magical thinking. I think we should trust people.
Excellent. And you mentioned labels there. Talk to us about labels. Is there something really great about a label and something that can perhaps make us feel like it turns into an us and them? And what I mean by that is, I know that there are people out there that when they either self-diagnose or when they get a medical diagnosis and they have this label, say ADHD, for example, they kind of feel this huge relief. Like, this is why I've been different my whole life. Like, now I understand a lot more about myself. And I'm sure that just feels so comforting to be able to grasp the reason.
100%. Yeah, it's vindicating.
Yeah, exactly. But then there's also kind of another side to it of, I hear a lot about neurotypical and neurodivergent. And if you're in that label, then you're in one category. And if you don't have one of those conditions, then you're in the other. And I wonder, does that create an us and them, or an us versus them mentality, do you think?
I think that exists in the online communities. And for some people, yeah, it will exist. I wouldn't say it was necessarily any different to any other form of us and them that exists. I think it's really important for the neurodivergent community to have a sense of social identity and inclusion, because our childhoods tend to be characterized by exclusion, marginalization, and ostracism. So finding a group of people who are like you and bonding with them, I think, is actually very healing. But in terms of, the us versus them, the neurodivergent community is quite new. We're quite, as a field, we're quite immature. If you look at, the depth of anti-racism work, that's been, that's got foundational principles dating back hundreds of years. And so when people join an activist and advocacy community around race or gender or sexuality, they're leaning into deep roots of people who've been there for many years, who can support that kind of psychological journey of feeling empowered and healed and able to advocate. So there's an immaturity to neurodivergence, which I think we will have to grow through. And I can see that in the element of us versus them, and sometimes the kind of spiky reactions that you get online. I know what you're talking about, but I would say that's a minority of experience, and the majority of experience is a sense of belonging, which people have lacked. So, great, have that sense of belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like you say, after being isolated so much, often from a very young age, it must be a real relief to know that there are other people that are experiencing similar things. Do you find, like, you've noticed, I noticed that you said there that happens online quite a lot. It's like you work with so many different businesses, right? So, how do you find that translates into the work?
Again, it can be either or. So we have a kind of proliferation of employee resource groups or affinity groups. People use slightly different words for it, but, there's a neurodiversity group of people that get together, and they can be very supportive of each other. They can be very good internal activists and collectively lobby for changes. Where I've seen them work really well is, if we're pitching to do work with a company to be their neurodiversity partner, sometimes we get interviewed by the neurodiversity affinity group. And I think, we should. That's a really good use of their time. But sometimes they can also be kind of quite unboundaried. And I've seen affinity groups where they're kind of swapping notes on each other's reports and saying things to each other like, oh, well, I don't think you are ADHD. I think that's a dyslexic profile. And, well, I've got these adjustments and you don't have those adjustments. So what, and that can be quite touchy. So I think they need boundaries. I think they need a remit. I think they need to be sponsored by somebody senior within the organisation. And when they've got those kind of guardrails in place, affinity groups can be really, really healthy. And make a massive difference for the business. But they do need guardrails.
Excellent. Okay, you mentioned this earlier and I'm really excited to talk about it. Can you talk to us about the Spiky profile? And again, when we talk about this, like, I've noticed that language is such a big part of this whole topic, and words like spectrum, especially when it comes to autism, being on the spectrum, things like that are kind of now really moving into out-of-date terminology, aren't they? So how does the Spiky profile kind of transition into that now?
Well, the Spiky profile is a description rather than an identity. So it's less vulnerable to those things. All inclusion movements have evolving language. This is no different to any other inclusion field in that respect. Think about the words we use for race. Think about the difference between saying black and brown communities versus saying people of colour. But, the use of capitalisation for the word black, as opposed to when we didn't capitalise it. There's subtleties in all inclusion movements. A woman can identify as gay, queer or lesbian, and an autistic person can identify as autistic, neurodivergent, on the spectrum. It's their choice. So although words do tend to evolve, and I think, it just as it's our job to educate ourselves with regards to appropriate language for race and sexuality inclusion, it is appropriate for us to keep an eye on how language changes. But if this isn't our specialism, then, if we use a word that's wrong, we simply apologise and move on. And we acknowledge that there's a lot of diversity within the neurodivergent community. I know some parts of the neurodivergent community that really like to use the word neurodiverse instead of neurodivergent. They find neurodivergent othering, but that's not a majority opinion. That's a minority opinion. So we should probably use the word neurodivergent, but some people might disagree with us. And we've just got to learn to be okay with that, actually. It's not the end of the world if you use the wrong language with the right intention. If you can use the wrong language and someone says, actually, or just ask people how they want to identify. I've given you a few examples, but any examples I give you will date this podcast immediately because things do morph and change. And that's what we just have to remember, is that that's completely normal and it happens in all inclusion fields.
Absolutely. And talk to us about that spiky profile then. If I say the word spiky profile, I'm sure lots of people won't necessarily know what that means. So can you give us a kind of idea of what it does, how it helps, all of that stuff?
So the spiky profile is simply if I plot a range of different abilities and skills on a graph, and then draw a line between all of the data points, it will form a spiky line where things go up and down. So, for example, on my spiky profile, there's a big difference between my working memory capacity and my spatial reasoning. My spatial reasoning is really, really high, and my working memory capacity is a bit rubbish, really. So it means there's a massive difference, and people might have big spikes between their literacy ability versus their verbal skills. They might have big spikes between their fine motor control versus their literacy ability. Where people's spikes tend to define the neurotype they end up getting labelled with. But essentially all it means is that there's these big difference. So if you're a neurotypical person and I plot all of your abilities on a line, it will be a reasonably flat line. It could be a reasonably flat line in the average range or the high average range or the low average range, but it will be a reasonably flat line. If I plot a neurodivergent person's abilities on a graph, it will be a big spiky line covering, a range of different areas and abilities. So I once assessed somebody who was in the top 3%, for their verbal skills. So they were, out of every 100 people that were measured, I'm only likely to find 3 people as brilliant as this person was for verbal communication. But conversely, he was in the bottom 7% for processing speed. So how quickly he could process fine, detailed information, like reading, like forms, like decoding a spreadsheet. That was in the bottom 7% of the population. And that's actually quite a low score. So if everything that guy could do was on the bottom 7%, he would have difficulty living on his own. He wouldn't be able to read menus, work out bills, plan shopping. So it's quite a low score. But this was someone who had run and sold a successful business and was doing an MA in psychotherapy. So, he was functioning well as an adult human, but he had this huge difference between the two abilities. And the reason he'd come to see me is because, of course, he was failing his MA because he couldn't keep up with the reading. His processing speed was too slow to keep up with the reading. But every time he did a practical assessment of his skills as a psychotherapist, which is his verbal ability, he was acing them. So he was getting kind of, distinctions for his work in practice and then just failing his written work.
Wow. And then, so from that, are you able to then support them? Like, if someone's not good at potentially keeping up with reading or the processing, as you say, how do you work with that to help them when you think like that's obviously part of his MA? How can you help someone to then work through that problem, as it were, for them?
Well, I think there are 2 ways to answer this question. So there's what I would do with that person as an individual, but there's also what I would say to the world about that person. So as an individual, I might fit them up with some assistive technology so that they could listen to the books they're trying to read rather than read them, or listen and read at the same time, because multisensory processing of information will give your brain more to work with and you might be able to process it quicker. I would work on techniques for skim reading, for making notes whilst reading. So setting up kind of documents ready to drop bits of information into so that they start to form the basis of an essay before you start the essay. So we could go through those sorts of techniques. I think simply knowing that would be useful for that person, because it means that they'd stop giving themselves a hard time, and they would kind of realise that they maybe had to prioritise more time for their reading and writing tasks. They might have to think about a specific time of day when they do it, when they think at their best. Some people are night owls, some people are morning birds. So, you might want to plan your diary around being at your best, most energetic time of day. There are lots of things we can do to augment that person's ability to read and write in order to pass their MA. But the other thing I would say is, being a psychotherapist is a job that involves talking. And that's the thing that he does well. So why have we barriered that career by asking this person to pass exams in a technique that he doesn't do well, to do a job where he'll never need to use that technique again? Do you know, we've created the barrier to that job. We've made him disabled by making that the entry criteria, and we do that over and over and over and over again. So the way you become a consultant surgeon is you have to pass a multiple choice quiz online. And a multiple choice quiz is full of grammatical idiosyncrasies where you've got 4 sentences that look the same, but some of them have got double negatives in them, for example. So we're not measuring, we think we're measuring that person's long-term memory, which we are, and that's important. People who are going to be, lead surgeons need to have good long-term memory of what different things are. But the way we're measuring that long-term memory is through the barrier of complex grammar, which is completely irrelevant to the skills of a surgeon. So you're going to have people who are brilliant surgeons who can't get through that exam, and you're going to have people who are rubbish surgeons who can get through that exam. So the method of assessment doesn't match the job. Does that make sense? And we do, and we do that over and over again. We do that. We interview for data analyst work. Why? Why? Who cares? Who cares about their verbal skills? Can they analyze data? Are they really good at it? Are they really quick? Do they have the opposite skill to my client? Really high processing speed and perhaps really low verbal ability. But the job of a data analyst doesn't need verbal ability. It needs high processing speed. So why are we interviewing them? When I'm recruiting for our finance team, we don't interview people. We give them a spreadsheet full of holes and see if they can find the holes and understand the patterns. And then if they want to email me what they think, or call me on the phone and tell me what they think, or interview me and tell me what they think, I don't really care, whatever works best for them, because the skill that predicts success at the job is being able to look at a set of management accounts or an Excel spreadsheet and process that kind of data quickly and efficiently and make meaning from it. So, but that isn't specific to neurodivergence. That's specific to the whole world. The way our education systems are designed and the way we do selection and assessment for employment and for talent, we don't measure the skill that we want in the job. We measure what we think everybody needs to be able to do. We're really stuck in a kind of, we've done this historically, so we'll keep on doing it without actually ever challenging it and going, do we need data analysts to interview well? Maybe we don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a really interesting point. So for the job, maybe a data analyst doesn't need to interview well, but what about for culture of a team? Because I know that a lot of people nowadays, we have these values around great communication within the team, and so how do we kind of fit this excellence for a job into the culture side of things?
Well, it depends what your culture is. Culture is a socially contrived phenomenon. We're making that up permanently. And we're making it up based on race and gender as well. Have you ever seen that famous cartoon? What's the difference between assertive and aggressive? It says one person sat in an office and the other person says your gender.
Yeah, okay. I haven't seen it, but...
Okay, so, if you want to talk about appropriate communication from a culture perspective, we don't need to go anywhere near neurodivergence before we've got an exclusive hierarchical system based on the dominant power of the white supremacist patriarchy. We're already there. So, I think there are a million reasons why we need to unpick this thing that we call culture and communication. At Genius Within, what we've done about that is we've created a manual of business etiquette, because what the most common problem for neurodivergent people is not picking up unwritten rules. We've written down social rules around when things are wrong. If you're upset about something, how many people could you speak to about it? If someone calls you upset about something, how can you respond in a way that's supportive and kind, but also doesn't lead to fear, anxiety, and gossip? So we've actually been down and given people a steer on all of those things. And we find we have quite a lovely culture, actually, with 68% neurodivergent people, and 22% LGBTQ, and 60% white, which is underrepresented for the UK. And we have a high level of psychological safety, a high level of engagement, and low turnover, because we've kind of written down the basics, but what we also do is have very clear structures for when people get that wrong. And those structures involve not blaming them for getting it wrong, but just sort of having a process by which we can unpick it. So we call them wash-ups. Something went wrong in a meeting, it got a bit tetchy. So let's say somebody left, somebody lost their temper, somebody got really upset. We don't just let that go. We come back afterwards and go, right, what happened? Where did that come from? How have we as a system failed so that someone's got to the point where they've had a little overspill or an overwhelm in some way? How can we prevent that from happening next time? And, what do we actually want to say about that? So we give people a kind of a roadmap for how to recover from something like that, rather than pretend it isn't happening.
Yeah, so important. Yeah, that's really helpful and really practical, actually. An inclusive way of inviting all types of different types of people is to actually have some expectations and have them visible for people to really be able to follow.
Totally. So, so culture and communication is important, but we think it's our job to make that happen rather than just buy in people that fit. Do you know?
Yeah.
Because if you do the buying
absolutely.
in people that fit, what you end up with is people that are like you. Because my communication style as an ADHD woman is very, 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 very different to the communication style of an autistic man. I mean, that's the other thing. We've got 68% neurodivergent people. So we've got people at the edges, at the margins, in the way that they communicate and the way that they like to work. But we're opposites. Neurodivergent people aren't an amorphous mass. So the level of chaos and irregularity that I need in order to be creative at work is completely disabling for an autistic person who likes routine and consistency. So you can't have us two working in the same team without a way of communicating about those issues and letting each other know when someone else's need for consistency is disabling my ability to be creative. I need a way to be able to talk about that isn't emotional, that isn't blamey, that doesn't make me right and them wrong. That also doesn't make, I'll just have to sacrifice my creativity because, I'm the boss and bosses have to sacrifice themselves for everybody else. Instead, why don't I just, rather than treating that person like an idiot or like a child where I have to be their mummy, why can't I just have an adult to adult conversation with them and go, do you know what, I'm struggling with this because of this. What a compromise I'd like to suggest is X. Could that work for you? And they go, oh yeah, that could work for me if we did this. Okay, great, let's do that. And so we just license the ability to talk about culture and communication. We make it something that's overt, that's described, that's talked about, rather than something that's an assumed underlying rule that you're just supposed to know about. And if you don't know about it, it means we didn't recruit you right. So or we need to fire you or move you or, whatever it is. So, I just think I think that's not just better for neurodivergence. That's also better for cultural competence and gender inclusion as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, right? I think sometimes it can feel like talking about neurodivergence as a separate thing, but actually that's the whole point, is that we want it to be inclusive, actually just having some really well-rounded ideas that can support everyone. You've given us so much insightful kind of and practical steps to take from things that you've done. What is a great first step for an agency owner or an agency leader that might be listening to this? What first steps can they take that starts to address, all of these things that we've talked about?
Well, I mean, I would send them to our Genius Finder. That's where I would send people, because the Genius Finder is a good way of getting your own spiky profile or flat profile, as it may be, but starting to think about the way people may or may not be kind of having strengths and challenges in the workplace. And what we've done with the Genius Finder is we've demedicalized it. So it isn't going to measure your processing speed compared to the general population. It's not going to measure your verbal skills compared to the general population, but it is going to kind of measure the functional performance correlates of that, if that makes sense. So do you find it, is social communication easy or hard for you? Is using your memory at work an easy or hard thing? How easy is it or hard is it for you to do self-organization? So in very practical, job-relevant terms, you will find your strengths and weaknesses. And then that signposts you to 430 strategies that would be, well, we won't sign you to all of them because you won't have problems in all of those areas, but a blend of 430 strategies that are specific to those challenges. And then that allows you to do what I'm saying, which is just to talk about what works well and what doesn't work well from a very practical perspective, rather than feeling the need to go, oh, I wonder if this person is dyslexic, or I wonder if I'm dyslexic. Just go, well, this is what I find easy at work. This is what I find difficult at work. And here's some things that help that I'm going to start doing. And you can get your colleagues to do that. You can get your employees to do that. And then the other thing that the Genius Finder does is it gives you a heat map as a business. So once you've got more than 10 people using it in your business, it will tell you the business's spiky profile. And once you've got the business's spiky profile, then you know what you need to do to make things more neuro-inclusive. So if you've got a bunch of people who are struggling with self-organization, you need to look at training, you need to look at technology, you might want to hire differently. When we did this for Genius Within, we saw how low our self-organization skills were as a business. We decided to hire an administrator and a project manager, someone to support self-organization at the top and the underneath, So there are strategic ways you can be more inclusive without having to get everybody to have a diagnosis or to have a workplace needs assessment or to go through, because actually that's not an efficient use of resources. And there's a lot of people that you could spend a lot of money on. And what you find out, I mean, this is why I invented the Genius Finder, is because having done thousands of diagnostic assessments and workplace needs assessments and researched this for over 10 years, the things that people find the most helpful tend to be free.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it?
So why are we spending thousands of pounds assessing people and months of their life assessing them, when actually the things that are going to help them to be productive and perform well at work are free? So I've got 430 free things that you can go and be signposted to. And if you can implement that across the business, you might not need to go through so much. You still will for some people. Some people are kind of very extreme on the spiky profile, and they still might need formal things like the assistive technology that I was describing earlier, or coaching to help them work on those things. But you can take care of a huge level of need. So I would think about using the Genius Finder. I've written a book called Neurodiversity Coaching. The first 3 chapters explain neurodiversity at work. The very, what is neurodiversity? What strengths are likely to be present in the workplace? What challenges are likely to be present in the workplace? And how you can work with those. That was intended to be read by managers as well as coaches. And I've got a book coming out in February next year called Neurodivergent Leadership, Leading from Neurodivergent Leadership, the third chapter of which, that third section, sorry, not chapter, 4 chapters in one section. The third section is devoted to creating neuro-inclusive companies. based on my experience. So it's all of those stories of how we've made Genius Within neuro inclusive, and none of the things at Genius Within that we do to make it neuro inclusive involve compromising performance. And I think that's really important to note, because what I see happening a lot is managers thinking, right, this person is neurodivergent, therefore they can't do X, therefore I will do X for them. And when the manager does that, what happens is that person never learns to do X. So it limits their career progression immediately. And then it also means that their job is only viable if that manager continues to do it. So if that manager gets tired, loses patience, let's say one of their parents goes into hospital and they have to take on a caring role, or they become a parent, or, you know, anything that can happen in your life, and that manager's support goes, that employee is immediately vulnerable. So we can't support neurodivergence by doing things for people or by just giving them an easier time. We have to think about how can we build the resilience, the independence, the scaffolding to allow this person to do their job independently and successfully, so that they can continue to grow. We need to have ambition for neurodivergent people. We need to believe in their ability to learn and grow. They just might need it done slightly differently. They might need to do that thing that they find hard at home, work from home on a Friday, so that they can do it without any distractions. That we can do. But just saying to people, oh, that 10% of your job that you find hard, don't do it anymore. That's not an option. Or it might be, you might have 7 people in the team and you decide to move the team roles around and you do a whole job design thing. But if you do that, do it officially. Put it into their job description. Change the way that you're appraising their behaviour. Make it be an agreement that we do this, because do you know what? Nancy's great at data analysis. So if we get Nancy to do more data analysis than phone work, our team will be more efficient like that. But, actually Chloe's really good at phone work, so we're to get Chloe to do the bulk of the phone work and less data analysis. If you've got an arrangement like that, do that too. But it's got to be above board. We can't have neuro-inclusion meaning that somebody is just sort of rescuing, and helping. When we do that, we're patronising people and we're limiting their career development.
Yeah, that is so powerful, because I think that is something that people would easily fall into, isn't it?
Oh, God. Oh my God, they do. Yeah. And then what happens is those people lose their jobs. They lose their jobs 6 months later because the manager's had enough. And they don't know why they've lost their jobs. They get really confused. And it's traumatic. It's traumatic for that person. They're like, well, actually, Chloe said it was fine that she would do my end of week report every week, and she's been doing it every week for the last 6 months. So I don't understand why I'm now losing my job because of my paperwork. It's confusing and upsetting.
Yeah, and takes people straight back to the isolation and
exactly.
feelings that they had when they were younger of being outcast. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's really practical and helpful advice for those people that are kind of in those leadership positions. What if someone listening is part of the team, maybe not in a leadership position? How can they best advocate for themselves if they're noticing that there are needs that they have that aren't quite being met, do you think?
I would do what I've suggested. I would take the Genius Finder and I would take the report and I would go and talk to somebody. I'd go, these are the things I find easy at work and I'm really good at these things. These are the things that I find struggle. And here's some suggestions that I'm going to implement. Can we have a conversation about this? I think in a workplace, the best thing is to make it about performance and productivity and well-being. And, employers want their staff to be able to work at their best. We want that. I find that there are more well-meaning managers out there than real tyrants. If you've got a real tyrant who won't have that conversation with you, you have a different problem. And your problem is that you work for a tyrant and you probably need to find a new job. Like, let's just normalize going, let's not have tyrants as bosses. Let's just normalize that. It's not a good idea. Leave. But, the likelihood is you don't have a tyrant. You've got someone who hasn't had a lot of training themselves, isn't very confident in their own management skills, wants to do the best by you, doesn't really know how to do it, is desperate for some sort of practical roadmap. So if you do a Genius Finder, what you'll get is a practical roadmap of how to do this, and a way of having the conversation that doesn't involve you talking about whether or not you may or may not be neurodivergent. And you can have that conversation around it, but it's very practical. It can sit on your HR file. No one needs to be embarrassed or what. It's not healthcare data, so it doesn't kind of tip into GDPR antsiness where we're all really worried about who's sharing this. Well, we're worried about who's sharing it, but you know what I mean. It doesn't have the same fear factor. So I just think, go for it that way. Talk about spiky profiles, talk about being good at some things and not good at other things. This is, here's some ideas. I'd like to talk to you about them. Start there.
Yeah. And I think the main theme through all of this is having those conversations, not being afraid to actually discuss what's going on. That is just something that I'm definitely taking away. And we'll put the finder in the show notes as well. So if anyone's interested, we'll pop that in the show notes. So this has all been so helpful, and I'm really, really grateful for you to kind of share these tips with us. On a personal level, what's your vision for the future of neurodiversity in the workplace, and neurodivergence in the workplace? If you could have your ideal world, what would it look like?
Well, I think if we get this right and we start looking at the way that we personalise work environments to enable people to work at their best, then that's just a lesson for life. And I think what it will do is help all businesses. So if you design things for people on the edges, you get the middle for free. So the more we can think about the people on the edges and think about our work environments, workstations, workflow, work communication, and make those more accessible for the people who are on the edges, then actually it will benefit everybody. Because what we'll be doing is just having more clarity and more flexibility, more human flexibility. So things like sensory sensitivity that are absolutely disabling for neurodivergent people aren't comfortable for neurotypical people. So let's really look at sensory sensitivity. Let's get that nailed down. Let's stop having really echoey open plan offices where people can't hear themselves think. Let's really think about the way we design offices so that they're more conducive to human functioning. Let's think about the way we communicate, and all of the autistic people who are like, what on earth are you talking about? That's a weird rule. I don't understand it. Let's go, actually, do you know what? You're right. Let's get rid of that rule, or let's explain it in a way that autistic people understand. And then all of the new people, the young people coming into the office who haven't learned the social rules of the office yet, will get it quicker too. The other thing is that the things that neurodivergent people struggle with across their whole life actually also affect people increasingly in old age. So things like a processing speed difficulty or sensory sensitivity. Sensory sensitivity comes with perimenopause. It comes with if you're dealing with chronic pain. Processing speed difficulties come with long-haul COVID. They come with perimenopause. They come with multiple sclerosis. They come with people who've had cancer treatment. They come with people who are managing chronic pain. So, we've got an aging workforce who are going to increasingly need the same things that neurodivergent people need as standard. So if we listen to what neurodivergent people need and build that into the design of our workplaces, we will get everyone else for free. So I think neurodiversity is our pathway. It's the roadmap. It's the practical skills of how are we going to make workplaces more conducive to human functioning. It's not the 19th and 20th century anymore. We don't need humans to be automatons that do the same thing on a machine assembly line over and over and over again. We need people to be creative and innovative. The World Economic Forum has highlighted that the skills needed for the 21st century are creativity, innovation, problem solving, entrepreneurial flair. This is what, in order to have those skills, you need a certain amount of safety. And neurodivergent people have those skills in spades. So let's create the conditions for work teams and employees to have those thinking skills. And that's going to involve a bit of change, I think, on our part. But yeah, I think the neurodiversity field tells us where the changes should be. They're here. Sensory sensitivity, processing speed, unwritten social rules. Let's get that stuff knocked out.
Amazing. And I think that leads us quite nicely onto the question that I ask everyone at the end of the podcast, which is, what does beautiful business mean to you?
My first thought when I thought of it was Genius Within, was my company. I love my company. I love my CEO. You know, I gave up the CEO role and got someone else to do it because she was better at it than me. Do you know? And that, just as a story, I think that sums up Genius Within. We all work for the greater good. We work for the greater good of our community and the greater good of the business. And we don't have our ego tied up in power dynamics or getting ahead of each other. And that's beautiful. And as a result, we feel like a beautiful business because it feels safe. It feels safe to go, I'm not good at this. Can someone help me? Or I'm not good at this. I think I need to move. Let's look at a succession plan for someone taking over this role. And I'd like to go that way. And we just morph and evolve because the fundamental thing underpinning all our work is, what's your genius within? Are you working to your genius within? Are you fulfilling your potential as a human right now? And if you're not, what do we need to do differently for that to be possible for you?
I love that. That's such a lovely answer. How nice to think of your own company straight away.
I know. Well, my colleagues are amazing. Can I name check them? So Jackie Wallace, our CEO, is absolutely phenomenal. Fiona Barrett, my COO, has been with me for over 10 years. She didn't want to take over the CEO role either. She said her genius within was to be the power behind the throne, and she's absolutely right. She's a brilliant COO. I've got Royston Collins in my directorship and Helen, our finance director. And the five of us as a director team absolutely nail it. And then around us, we've got this next generation of leaders coming through. We've got Ian, who's heading up our digital team with Zach. I've got Kate Omenigo Pearson, who is our head of partnerships, Angelica Simpson, our head of HR, Jess Solom, our head of delivery. We've got the next. I can see the next generation of Genius Within leaders already coming through and doing their work. It's gorgeous.
So exciting. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think it's so lovely to hear. I can see how excited and passionate you are about it. And honestly, I feel like our conversation today has, again, I've even having done so much research recently, I just feel like there's so much to learn all the time. So talking to you and hearing what you have to say about it, I think has really helped me and hopefully a lot of people that are listening. And thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the Beautiful Business Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please remember to subscribe and leave us a review. For more advice and practical tips on what it's really like to build a beautiful business, visit our content hub at wowco.uk/hub or check out the link in the show notes.
all inclusion movements have evolving language. Think about the words we use for race. There's subtleties in all inclusion movements. A woman can identify as gay, queer, or lesbian, and an autistic person can identify as autistic, neurodivergent, on the spectrum. It's their choice. It is appropriate for us to keep an eye on how language changes. But if this isn't our specialism, then, if we use a word that's wrong, we simply apologise and move on. It's not the end of the world if you use the wrong language. Any examples I give you will date this podcast immediately, because things do morph and change. And that's what we just have to remember, is that that's completely normal, and it happens in all inclusion fields. So the spiky profile is simply if I plot a range of different abilities and skills on a graph, and then draw a line between all of the data points, it will form a spiky line where things go up and down. So, for example, on my spiky profile, there's a big difference between my working memory capacity and my spatial reasoning. My spatial reasoning is really, really high, and my working memory capacity is a bit rubbish, really. So it means there's a massive difference, and people might have big spikes between their literacy ability versus their verbal skills. They might have big spikes between their fine motor control versus their literacy ability. Where people's spikes are tend to define the neurotype they end up getting labelled with. But essentially all it means is that there's these big difference. So if you're a neurotypical person and I plot all of your abilities on a line, it'll be a reasonably flat line. It could be a reasonably flat line in the average range or the high average range or the low average range, but it will be a reasonably flat line. If I plot a neurodivergent person's abilities on a graph, it will be a big spiky line covering, a range of different areas and abilities.